So now that we've had a look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration and their significance in living things, let's get back to that discussion about how energy flows through ecosystems. We've described photosynthesis as being the gateway for new energy to enter the system of the Earth. And we know that photosynthesis is performed by plants, algae, and certain types of bacteria. These organisms are the foundation of what we call the trophic levels in a community of organisms. They are known as the producers, the autotrophs that not only self feed, but also supply the energy for the other organisms in the ecosystem through the course of being eaten by the heterotrophs or the consumers. So, primary consumers represent the next trophic level, and these are typically herbivores that eat the producers, but these primary consumers are also themselves consumed, specifically by secondary consumers that are carnivores or omnivores, and so on, up through tertiary consumers and even quaternary consumers. So each of these levels in the trophic pyramid here represents a step in a food chain. And a food chain might be a more familiar concept to you. A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms through which nutrients and energy pass as one organism eats another. In the past, you may have seen food chains represented like this in a linear fashion, where one organism consumes another in these trophic levels. But in fact, a more informative representation of a food chain within an ecosystem is that pyramid shape. And that's because the pyramid shows you the relative abundance and amount of energy contained within each level of the food chain. So producers are the most abundant, and the largest amount of energy is also found housed in the producers. As we move up the pyramid, at each trophic level, energy is lost as heat. So remember when we talked about the inefficiency of chemical reactions in a previous section? So when I eat a hamburger, my body burns the chemical energy in that hamburger to provide for my functions. But those chemical reactions are leaky, and some of the chemical energy in the hamburger bleeds off as heat. So, hence why our bodies are warm. Now, if a bear comes along and eats me, she's not going to get all of the energy that was in the hamburger that I ate because much of it has left my body and gone off into the environment as heat. That energy doesn't get transferred up to the next level of the trophic pyramid to the bear that eats me. And in fact, only about 10% of the total energy in a trophic level carries up to the next level because of this inefficiency. That's why the levels get smaller as you move up. It takes a lot of producers to support a smaller amount of primary consumers because the primary consumers can only derive a certain percentage of the producer's energy. It takes a lot of primary consumers to support an even smaller amount of secondary consumers, and so on. So as you move up the levels, less energy becomes available, and organisms therefore become less abundant as well. Another model that is used to represent the energy consumption relationships in an ecosystem is a food web. So, whereas a food chain is linear and steps up neatly from one level to the next, a food web is more complex and shows multiple food chains that are interconnected with each other. So, in a food web, you are able to see how an organism can simultaneously play a role as both predator and prey in two different food chains. So, here we see a side by side comparison of an Arctic ecosystem food chain on the left versus an Arctic ecosystem food web on the right. And in the chain on the left, we move from plankton, a type of algae, as the producers, to krill, being the primary consumers, silverfish as the secondary, leopard seal, the tertiary, and the orcas, the quaternary. In the food web, we also see plankton and algae feature as the producers, but we can see how they are consumed by multiple species, from jellyfish to seabirds to cod, and we can see multiple organisms representing both predator and prey, such as the seal being a predator of polar cod while also being prey to the polar bear and the killer whale. So, overall, the food web provides a more complete picture of the consumption and energy relationships in an ecosystem. One aspect of the complexity in an ecosystem's energy flow that we haven't addressed yet, though, is what happens to organisms after they die. because there are also organisms that derive their primary source of energy from dead organic material. And these decomposers, as they are called, play an important role in recycling the energy and the nutrients remaining in the biomass of a dead organism back into the ecosystem. Most decomposers are bacteria, fungi, and insects, and you can see some examples here. And when a decomposer is an animal, there's a special term that we use for it. It's called a detritivore. So, crabs, earthworms, lobsters, many types of beetles, flies, sea cucumbers, these are all detritivores. And when we think about the relationship that detritivores have to a food web or food chain, they're kind of off separately doing their own thing. You'll often see them represented sort of distinctly from the rest of the relationships in the chain or the web, because really they consume everything. They consume every member of the ecosystem. They just do so after those members have died. So in these two examples, you can see the decomposers separated here. I've boxed them off in red, and everything else is sort of funneling into them. And these are actually considered two separate but interrelated food webs. The grazing food web is the one that is based on the consumption of living organisms, and then the detrital food web is based on the consumption of dead organisms. And in any given ecosystem, you can see both of them at play. The last topic, second to last topic we're going to touch on in this section is to talk about why this all matters. Why is it important to study food webs? One reason is that understanding food webs can give us a picture of the impact of human activity on an ecosystem. For example, as climate change causes the Arctic to warm and it causes sea ice to melt, algae that grow along the bottom surface of sea ice are becoming threatened. These sea ice algae are producers in the ecosystem, representing the lowest trophic level. They are eaten by krill, fish, plankton, which are in turn eaten by secondary consumers, and so on. So, changes in the climate that threaten the producers at the lowest, most foundational trophic level are expected to cause a sort of chain reaction to the consumers at higher levels in the web that depend upon them, either directly or indirectly, for their subsistence. Food webs also have practical purposes, such as in agriculture, because energy is just one of the components that flows through a food web. Nutrients flow through the food web as well, including nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfate, and other important ones. Organisms need certain ratios of these nutrients to function, and the ratio relationship between the nutrients is known as stoichiometry. So, stoichiometry refers to the proportions and ratios of components in a chemical reaction, including key nutrients in living organisms. Farmers are especially concerned with this because crop plants need to obtain certain ratios of nutrients in order to successfully grow. This food web, for example, depicts the ecosystem of a rice paddy, including the rice plant and a number of different microscopic organisms that inhabit the soil, including bacteria, protozoans, and microscopic worms called nematodes. And this graphic was published resulting from an experiment where rice was grown under high elevated CO2 conditions and increased nitrogen fertilizer conditions. And the researchers sought to determine what impact this would have on the flow of nutrients, not just through the rice itself, but also through the other microscopic members of the rice paddy ecosystem. Okay, we have one more item to cover related to food webs and energy flow, and that is the concept of gross and net primary productivity, which are essentially measures of how much energy is flowing into the ecosystem via the producers. Gross primary productivity, or GPP, is defined as the rate at which photoautotrophs produce organic matter or energy from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water per unit of land area per year. And as you can imagine, gross primary productivity varies from ecosystem to ecosystem. A tropical rainforest has a higher gross primary productivity than a desert. And this map right here of the continental United States shows the gross primary productivity of the land in different geographic areas, with the brown representing the lowest GPP and the darker green and blue shades representing the highest GPP. And as you can see, the areas that we would probably recognize as being temperate and subtropical, like The West Coast and the southeastern United States have the highest GPP, and the Intermountain West area, where we live, has the lowest. So, GPP is a useful measure when assessing how well a geographic region would be able to sustain agriculture or forestry based on its productivity. Another related useful measure of available energy is net primary productivity. So, net primary productivity, or NPP, is gross primary productivity minus the energy needs of the producer. Because when autotrophs perform photosynthesis and create carbohydrates, they have to burn some of those carbohydrates to support their own function. So, autotrophs actually perform cellular respiration too, and when they do, they typically use up about half of the energy that they have converted through photosynthesis for their own purposes, which leaves approximately the other half available to be potentially used by consumers. So, NPP is useful for understanding how much energy there is to be derived from producers by consumers such as ourselves.